Susan, you and I and 10,000 other people are just obsessed with consciousness. We have been for perhaps our whole lives.
Absolutely.
And I try to encapsulate the problem, if I can, in one simple sentence. And if I were to do that right now with you, I'd say the fundamental question to understand our inner subjectivity, that feeling of what it is inside, is it exactly the same as the brain in terms of some translational effect? Or is there something about consciousness that has to go beyond the brain, something irreducible, at least from the standpoint of brain science? That's my question.
Yeah. Well, let's examine those two possibilities and see what might be the most fruitful. I think if we assume there is some element that's not tractable to science, something that is irreducible, then that's a get-out-of-jail-free card. Okay, that means...
Well, that was very clear. I didn't say not susceptible to science. I said not susceptible to the brain.
Okay,
That's a distinction.
Okay. Nonetheless, as a brain scientist, I would regard that as a get-out-of-jail-for-free card. That is to say, whatever I did, whatever I showed you, whatever experiments I did, whatever theories I had in brain terms, we could always have this get-out-of-jail-for-free card saying, but there's the extra thing. And this extra thing is the thing that really counts. And this extra thing is something that we as brain scientists can't touch. Now, I don't find that very helpful. It reminds me of a cartoon slide I often show when I give talks, where you have these podgy male scientists, of course, stereotype male scientists, with a load of formula on one side, a load of formula on the other side, and then the middle gap says, and then a miracle happens. And one scientist is saying to the other, I think you should be a bit more explicit here in step 2, then a miracle happens. And then a miracle happens, or then there's a magic bit or a special bit, and of course, we can't deal with that. Whilst that might be possible, of course, that's not a very good starting point for brain science. So for me, if we want to make headway, if we want to tackle this problem, I would reject that hypothesis and I would go with the other possibility, which is that everything is reducible in some way, although reductionism is a dirty word, of course. I'd rather say explicable or interpretable or understandable in brain terms, or brain and body terms.
The extended thing is fine.
And something I find, again, unhelpful, because you can't say it's right or wrong, is this notion that our brains are like satellite dishes and out there floating in the ether is consciousness and you kind of pick it up. And as far as I understand it, that's the form of so-called panpsychism, where you have this property of the universe that's somehow picked
the way
up.
I try to express the alternative view, which I understand your view, and I've shared that in much of my life, but the alternative view is not so specific. It just says that the view that the brain will ultimately explain it all in some way is not right. Now, that could mean panpsychism, as you said, something on the universe. It could be a specific cosmic consciousness that maybe Eastern religions talk about. It could be a soul that Western religions talk about. It could be something that is so deeply extended beyond our physics, but in the physics world that we can never understand it. There's a lot of different other possibilities.
I think, however, that should be our final exhaustive conclusion once we've done all the brain science rather than a starting point. Okay. Because if it's a starting point, we give up. So it's a bit like being in Lisbon Harbour with Christopher Columbus. Say, oh no, there's no way to go. No, let's not bother. We don't know where you're going.
I totally agree. So here's the fundamental problem as a brain scientist. That you have to be able to convince me. I'm going to be a skeptic just for a moment here. You have to be able to convince me that everything that you do, the best way that you can come about it, is something beyond simple correlation, the neural correlates of consciousness, and that there is a neural causation of consciousness. You have to get me to the stage between correlation and causation, and what you're explaining in that causation is this feeling. This inner awareness.
Yeah. Well, that, of course, is the difficult issue, is where do we start? Where, as a scientist...
What could count as an explanation?
What could count as a subjective inner state, And what I have problems with is to, I say, even envisage what kind of answer, would be satisfactory.
And that point is what gives rise to the other cornucopia of different ways of trying to get out of it.
But my own view is that we haven't exhausted. We're limited by our own imaginations and abilities. Doesn't mean to say that it's wrong. Now, it might be wrong, But we have to keep all options open.
And I'm supportive of that. Do you have any idea of what an explanation could possibly be? Even if what you say is ridiculous, it could count as an explanation.
Yes, in some sense I do.
Okay.
In that I certainly feel...
My ears are open.
Okay, let's take certain things that we know about. We know about the placebo effect, for example, where an inert agent that you believe has therapeutic powers will amazingly often make you better. So that's just a very simple example where clearly the central nervous system is interfaced with the immune system and the endocrine system and the autonomic nervous system. Otherwise, you'd have biological anarchy.
Right.
So whatever we're talking about somehow has to account for and encompass the fact that the great control systems of the body are all interfaced, are all somehow working together.
Sure.
And my own view is that consciousness and the subjectivity of consciousness can influence objective things like the immune system. And we know also from the work of Antonio Damasio that what he calls somatic markers, these are agents that he posits circulate in the blood or released from the gut, can actually feed back onto the brain and influence brain states. So let's start with that. So my own view is that any explanation, however crazy it is and so on, has to put the brain back into contents of the body. There has to be a brain in a body plugged into all the great control systems and feeding back. My own view is that somehow there is an iteration of what we would call signaling molecules. That's to say agents that take messages or can actually transmit signals between these great control systems, that these are released from different organs in the body. They feed into the brain, meanwhile, reads out certain brain states, and I can specify that if you wish. And it's this iteration of these trilingual or multilingual chemicals that somehow, and of course, if I knew how, somehow translates into a subjective state. I myself don't need to invoke the brain as a satellite dish or something outside until the possibilities here have been completely exhausted.
I greatly admire your willingness to even pose possible explanations, and that's terrific. I think we need to do that and do more of that. And the counter argument to that or anyone will be the zombie argument. You can imagine exactly the same thing, which has the somatosensory feedbacks from the immune system, the various systems to keep the body in homeostasis and regular, in touch with its environment and optimized for its own behaviors and wellness and well-being and survival. And you could do all of that without an inner state. That's the key point. Why do you need the inner state?
Because in that case, the zombie argument back, it's not the same thing. If something is exactly the same thing, it is exactly the same thing, and exactly the same thing would incorporate, by definition, all these other things, the state of consciousness.
Okay, let me be more precise. Thank you. Exactly the same thing other than the inner feeling, because you can have all of the behavioral aspects, behavioral external aspects, and the internal behavioral aspects. It's a feedback mechanism.
Sure, but I would question again because otherwise it's a sort of it's a non-argument, it's a tautology to say everything's the same apart from consciousness. You don't have consciousness, therefore your argument's wrong. I mean, that doesn't quite make sense. I think internally, certainly in terms of behaviors, that's neither here nor there, but internally, the very fact that you have certain scenarios occurring in the brain, I would say automatically, implicit in them are inner states, and we can come on to how I think that. So to say, all these things are happening in the brain, exactly, but you don't have the inner state. I would argue that that is a non-argument, because I'm saying that with certain things happening in the brain, automatically you would have an inner state.
Okay, so this we're honing in on the issue. So you're defining a certain kinds of brain states as by force generating this inner feeling.
Yes. How it's done, of course, is another issue.
But that's important. That's an important step. That now we have a certain kind of. Now you wouldn't say all the things happening in the brain, because
no, of course not.
Of course not.
The respiratory center when you're asleep is not.
Right. There's 99% maybe of the brain can go on without that. So where do you how do you go to the next step?
Okay, so I'll unpack this because I think it's important that we sort of go step by step. So I can't give you a soundbite answer to this. I think if we start by thinking about unconsciousness, And this dawned on me when I was on holiday, actually. As often good ideas come when you're relaxing by the pool. And I was thinking about unconsciousness. And as you'll know, unconsciousness comes in degrees. It's continuously variable. So you have different stages of sleep and you have different stages of anesthesia. And there's now a device even that can measure depths of anesthesia to prevent over anesthetizing patients or not giving them enough and so on. And I thought, well, if you can have graded levels, continuously variable states of unconsciousness, couldn't you have, similarly, graded levels, continuously variable states of consciousness? And this would make sense, I thought to myself as I sat by the pool, because that would explain how a rat could be conscious, but not as conscious as a primate, and a primate could be conscious, but not as conscious as a human. So I know humans are primates, but you know what I mean. Monkeys are conscious. It could also explain how you, as an adult human being, could be more conscious at some times than at other times. And we talk about raising our consciousness or deepening our consciousness, so that sort of fits. And it doesn't matter whether you go up or down, but we talk about degrees of consciousness.
Sure.
And that to me seemed very attractive because I thought, well, here's something. Eureka, that we can measure. Scientists like measuring things. So we could think about consciousness now, if we think about it as continuously variable, we can think about it as something measurable. And if it's measurable, then we need to find something in the brain that is varying in degree that we can measure. And I would argue that when it's a certain size, you're conscious, and if it's too small, this thing, whatever it is, then that would be a correlate that showed you that there was unconsciousness. Yeah. So what could there be in the brain that could vary in degree on a sub-second level, because a second is a long time for a brain cell. I mean, as you all know, the electrical blip by which one brain cell communicates with another is a thousandth of a second, a millisecond. So we need something that's on that kind of scale, commensurate with those events, that varies from one moment to another very quickly, that we could say were varying with levels of consciousness. And we've known for the last 10 or 20 years now that the way the brain can work, and this is a new thing, and this is the condition, and this is the thing, which I call assemblies. Now, this is a loaded word, and other people might call it something else, but what I mean by an assembly is a coalition of brain cells, usually 10 to 100 million brain cells, that can actually be recruited to work together and then disband in less than a second. So that's how I personally define assemblies. And we can study these now with various dyes and the chicanery of modern neuroscience. And my own view, and we can go into this later, is that the duration and size of the assembly will match up with degrees of consciousness. And if the assembly is very small, then you won't be conscious anymore. And we've actually tested it. We've actually given anesthetic and shown that it shrinks. So we know that this is a possible way forward. Now, we don't know how an assembly size will translate into consciousness of a certain depth, but it's a start. It's a start of quantifying and looking at more and more precise matchings up between phenomenology and what's going on in the brain.